It was supposed to be a 2-day business trip, long enough for him to miss her, short enough not to feel like a lifetime. He had kissed her forehead that morning, told her he'd be back the next evening, and she had smiled, half asleep, murmuring, "Take care. I'll miss you." Those words replayed in his mind as he sat in the back seat of a cab, watching the familiar streets of his neighborhood pass by. A last-minute meeting had been postponed, and he decided to head home a day early, thinking maybe he'd surprise her. Maybe they'd cook together. Maybe he'd pick up flowers on the way and make her laugh like he used to. He imagined the scene in his head, her face lighting up at the door, her arms wrapping around him in disbelief, and that soft voice saying, "You're back already?" He smiled to himself. The driver pulled up to the gate. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange hue on the front of the house. Everything looked just as he'd left it. The potted plants she'd begged him to water, the wind chime that always rang too loudly when the wind picked up, the porch light already switched on, even though it was barely dusk. He paid the fare, picked up his small travel bag, and approached the door quietly, the kind of quiet meant for surprises. No sound, no movement. He fished out his keys slowly, careful not to make noise. His heart beat a little faster, like a boy about to give a gift to the girl he loved. The lock clicked open. The house was dim. Curtains drawn. It was too quiet. Usually, she played music when she was alone. Something soft, something classical. But today, nothing. He stepped inside and placed his bag near the shoe rack. He looked around. No sign of her in the living room. No rustling from the kitchen. "Maybe she's napping," he whispered to himself. He began walking toward the bedroom, slow, soft steps. But just as he passed the hallway, he paused. A faint sound came from the other side of the house. Not the bedroom. The guest room. He tilted his head, trying to make sense of it. Voices, low, muffled. A woman's and a man's. Then laughter. Hers. Familiar, but different. He moved toward the door quietly, his breath catching in his throat. It was closed. Light crept out from under the door. And then he heard her voice, clearer now. "You're bad, stop," she giggled. Not the kind of laugh she gave him when he told a bad joke. Not the laugh he'd fallen in love with. This one, it was flirty, intimate, alive in a way he hadn't seen in months. And then a male voice responded. Low. Confident. Teasing. He stood there. Frozen. His hands clenched. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be away. She didn't know he was home. And in that ignorance, she had let herself be real. He took a step back, almost stumbling against the wall. The realization landed slowly, not like an explosion, but like a heavy fog creeping in. He didn't need to open the door. He didn't need to see anything. The sound was enough. The laughter was enough. The betrayal was complete, wrapped in her voice, coded in the joy she hadn't shared with him in a long time. He stepped away, heart in pieces, lungs barely working. He didn't cry. Not yet. He couldn't. The shock was too fresh. The pain too raw. He walked back to the living room and sat down on the couch, staring at the dark TV screen. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't knock on that door. Somewhere inside that room, she was someone else. And out here, he was a man who had come home early, only to find his life shattered. He stood in the hallway, motionless, staring at the closed guest room door. His heartbeat echoed in his ears like distant thunder. Every breath felt like a betrayal to the air around him. That room had always been empty. A storage space. A spare room used for folded laundry, unopened packages, and things that didn't have a place elsewhere. But now it was locked. And behind it, laughter. Soft voices. Whispers. He had only taken 2 steps forward when her voice drifted through the wood, faint but unmistakably hers. Sweet. Flirtatious. Careless. Stop, someone might hear. He stopped. His hand hovered near the doorknob, instinctively, only to pull back as he realized the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked from the inside. His first instinct? Denial. Maybe she was on a call. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was a movie playing from her phone. Maybe anything but what it sounded like. But then came his voice.
A man.
Confident. Too close. The tone too familiar. The kind that belongs to someone who knows they're allowed to be there.
Relax.
He's not here, remember? And in that moment, everything stopped. The breath left his lungs. The hallway tilted slightly. His fingers curled into fists, not out of rage, but to hold himself together. Because everything inside him was coming undone. She had told him to take care. She had said she'd miss him. But she hadn't meant it. She hadn't even waited until he was fully gone. He had imagined surprising her with flowers. She had prepared her own surprise, just not for him. His mind tried to piece it together. The recent distance in her eyes. The coldness in her hugs. The late nights with no explanations. The messages she answered behind tilted screens. The laughter she no longer shared with him. It all made sense now. Too much sense. And yet, standing there, he didn't barge in. He didn't knock. He didn't break the door down and demand answers. He did something worse. He listened. Not to every word, but to the tone. To the softness in her voice. To the familiarity in his. He was hearing pieces of a world he was never meant to be a part of. A world she had kept hidden. One that she had built quietly, dishonestly, while pretending to still be his. His hands trembled. His chest felt heavy, like something invisible was sitting on it, refusing to let him breathe. He backed away slowly, each step harder than the last. He walked into the living room, and for a brief moment, he caught his reflection in the mirror hanging on the wall. His face looked older. Not because of age, but because of truth. He had walked in through that door as a husband. Now he stood there as a man betrayed. The world didn't fall apart with a scream. It fell apart with a whisper behind a locked door. And that sound, her voice, mixed with another man's, would stay with him forever. He stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, a silent witness to the slow, brutal collapse of everything he believed in. Every giggle that slipped through the cracks of that closed door stabbed deeper than the last. Every whisper, once sacred between them, now belonged to someone else. Every muffled sound twisted the knife inside his chest, carving out the truth he had refused to see for months. He couldn't move. His feet, once eager to rush through that door with excitement, now felt nailed to the floor. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but his heart, it just broke, quietly, one breath at a time. This wasn't how he imagined his love story would fall apart. He always believed if something ever went wrong, they'd talk. They'd cry. They'd fight if needed, but together. But there he was, alone, drowning in a silence filled with stolen laughter. He didn't know how long he stood there. Time felt blurred, like he had stepped into a moment that didn't belong to the life he knew. His chest ached, not from anger, not from rage, but from disbelief. The kind of pain that comes when the truth doesn't hit you all at once, but creeps in slowly, painfully, until it becomes undeniable. The woman he loved, the woman he had given his soul to, was someone else entirely. He thought back to the day they met. How her eyes used to light up when he walked into a room. How she'd laugh at the smallest things he said, even when no one else did. How she once told him, "You feel like home." But now, standing outside a locked door, he realized that version of her was gone. Or maybe she had never truly existed at all. Maybe he had fallen in love with the version she had shown him, the one carefully crafted from smiles and soft lies. Maybe he had filled in the blanks with his own hope. Maybe he had painted her in colors she never really wore. Because this woman, the one behind the door, whispering sweetly to another man, was a stranger. And that realization hurt more than anything. He felt his throat tighten. His eyes burned, but he refused to cry.
Not yet.
Not here. Cry would make it real. And he still wasn't ready to accept that everything he believed, every vow, every memory, was now stained with betrayal. He walked back to the living room slowly, like a ghost floating through his own home. He sat down on the couch, placing his hands over his knees, staring ahead at nothing. The silence in the room now felt cruel. Because once, this silence meant peace. Now, it echoed with the sounds of secrets.
He tried to think. What now?
What was the next step? Confront her? Scream? Break something?
But none of it felt right.
Because this wasn't about anger. It was about grief. He was mourning the death of something precious. The illusion of love. The belief that he mattered to her. The home he thought they had built together. He stood up and looked around the room. The frames on the wall, the curtains she had picked, the vase he bought for their second anniversary. Everything in the house still looked the same. But it all felt different. Because once trust is broken, even familiar things start to feel foreign. He didn't need more proof. He didn't need to open the door. He had already seen enough. Not with his eyes, but with his heart. And his heart was shattered. The door stayed closed. The voices stayed soft. But the damage, that was loud, deafening,
Permanent.
He stood just out of sight, his back pressed against the wall beside the guest room, the light above flickering gently, as if even the house wasn't sure how to react. He wasn't there to accuse. He wasn't there to confront. He was simply a listening, long enough to gather the kind of truth that doesn't just break the heart, it rewrites it. He heard his name once. Her voice, casual, careless, laughed as she said, "He's clueless. Still thinks I'm the same woman he married." The man with her chuckled, amused. "You really got him wrapped around her finger, huh?" She sighed, not out of guilt, but out of boredom. "He's just safe. Predictable. I needed something different. Something that makes me feel alive again."
Alive.
Different. Something. That's all he had become to her now. Not someone. Something. A phase. A habit. A background to the life she wanted to live in secret. And as she laughed again, the same laugh that used to make him believe in forever, he realized it was never about love. Not for her. For him, she had been his whole world. For her, he had been a convenience, a structure, a shelter, until she found someone who offered storms that excited her more than peace. He leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closed, fists clenched. Not because he was about to fight, but because he was holding in every scream, every sob, every shattered piece of his soul. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even shocked anymore. He was just tired. Tired of trying. Tired of believing. Tired of being lied to by the one person he trusted most. And still, he didn't open the door. Because what would be the point? She had already said everything. And the worst part? She hadn't even tried to hide it. There was no guilt in her voice. No hesitation. Only confidence, like she knew he'd never find out. Like she thought he was too blind to ever see the truth. But he had heard it now. Every word. Every chuckle. Every insult she wrapped in charm. And those words, they would follow him. In the quiet of lonely nights. In the spaces between thoughts. In the moments he would question his worth. He still thinks I'm the same woman he married.
No.
She wasn't. And maybe she never was. Maybe the woman he married was a role she played until she grew bored of it. Until she wanted a different stage. A different audience. He finally stepped away from the door, each step heavier than the last. His heart was no longer breaking. It had already broken. And now he was learning how to carry the pieces. She didn't know he had come home early. She didn't know he had heard everything. But someday, maybe days, maybe years from now, she would notice the look in his eyes, the stillness in his voice, the silence in his presence. And maybe she'd wonder what changed. But by then, it would be too late. Because the thing about betrayal is, it doesn't always scream when it arrives. Sometimes, it just listens. And when it does, it remembers everything. She opened the door with the kind of carelessness only someone truly comfortable in their lie could carry. Hair slightly messy, cheeks flushed, eyes lit, not from surprise, but from being interrupted too soon. She wasn't expecting him. That much was obvious. He stood there, just a few feet from her, watching silently, expression unreadable, heart shattered, chest hollow. And then she did something that broke him in a new way. She smiled. Not the smile of someone relieved. Not the smile of someone happy to see him home. But the smile of someone who had rehearsed too many cover stories and was ready for another one.
Oh.
"You're back already," she said, voice light, acting surprised.
He didn't respond.
Behind her, the room was dim. The smell of cologne that didn't belong to him lingered faintly in the hallway. And footsteps, the quiet kind that belong to someone who knows they shouldn't be heard, moved away from view. She stepped forward, casually closing the door halfway behind her, as if sealing the scene. "It's just a friend," she added too quickly, too confidently. That sentence alone, "just a friend," was enough to confirm everything he had already heard. He looked at her, long, slow, deep. Not like a man looking at his wife, but like a man looking at a stranger wearing his wife's face. "A friend?" he asked softly. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear.
"Yeah."
"You know Adil, right? We went to college together. He was just in the area, thought he'd drop by." Then she laughed.
Forced.
"You're being quiet, surprised to see me behaving myself?" It was a performance. A play she had written for herself. A version of reality she believed she could control if she just stuck to the script. But what she didn't realize was that the curtain had already fallen. And he had already read the ending. He didn't react, didn't accuse, didn't shout, "I heard everything." He just looked into her eyes. And for the first time, he saw it clearly.
Fear.
Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of being known. Because in that moment, she realized he wasn't just suspicious. He knew. "You didn't call," he said finally, voice calm. "Didn't text. Not once." She shrugged. "I figured you were busy. You usually are when you're away." He smiled faintly, but not because anything was funny. "Yeah," he whispered. "I usually am." And then, silence. The kind that sits in the center of the room like a third presence. The kind that makes liars uncomfortable. She shifted slightly, crossing her arms, not out of cold, but to protect herself from his eyes. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked. He didn't answer. Because how do you explain to someone that you're looking at them not as who they are, but as who they could have been? He wanted to ask her, was it worth it? Was the thrill worth the trust? Was the moment worth the years we built together?
But he didn't ask.
Because he already knew the answer. Instead, he simply nodded. "Tell your friend goodbye," he said, walking past her. "I'll be in the other room. I need to think." Her lips parted as if to respond, to defend, to distract, to soften. But she said nothing, because deep down, she felt it too. This time, the lie didn't work. This time, the silence wasn't her weapon. It was his. And it spoke louder than anything she could say. He walked down the hallway with the kind of silence that speaks louder than screams. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of what he'd just witnessed, but because of what he'd finally accepted. The woman he loved no longer existed. In the dim light of the guest bedroom, someone else remained behind a closed door. A stranger. Both of them. And as for him, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He entered their bedroom, a room that once held warmth, memories, whispered laughter, midnight talks, and promises that now felt like cruel jokes. He shut the door quietly behind him and locked it. Not to keep her out, but to keep himself in. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, hands folded together. His mind was loud, chaotic, but his body was still. Frozen. He stared at the wedding photo on the dresser. 2 smiling faces. 2 hands locked together. 2 people full of hope. He wondered, were we ever real? Or were we just a dream I wanted to believe in? The room felt too big now. Too empty. Like all the love they once shared had packed up and left before he even walked through the door earlier that evening. Eventually, he stood and walked to the mirror above the dresser. At first, he didn't see anything. Then he leaned in, looked closer, and for the first time, he saw him. The man who had stayed too long, loved too hard, and broken too silently. The reflection staring back wasn't just tired, it was lost. The eyes once full of warmth were now dimmed, hollow. The smile that once greeted her each morning had disappeared. Even the posture, once confident, steady, was now slumped under the weight of unspoken pain. He touched his own face, ran a hand through his hair. There were creases now, not from age, but from worry. From nights spent overthinking her silences. From mornings pretending everything was fine. He whispered to the reflection, "Who are you?" Because he no longer knew. He used to be the guy who brought flowers home, just because. Who made coffee for both of them, even when running late. Who gave without keeping score. Who believed love could conquer anything, even distance, even silence.
But now?
Now he was the man who stood outside a locked door, listening to the woman he loved betray him with another. The man who didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't beg. The man who carried heartbreak in his chest like a ticking clock, counting down the end of everything he thought was forever. And in that quiet room, in front of that unforgiving mirror, he realized something. This pain would change him. Forever. Not into someone bitter. Not into someone cold. But into someone who no longer gave away his heart so carelessly. Into someone who would think twice before believing soft words without action. Into someone who had learned the hardest way possible that love without loyalty is a wound, not a gift. She had broken his heart, but now she had no access to it, because the man standing in that room was no longer hers to hurt. The next morning, she knocked on the bedroom door. Softly at first. Then again, louder, 3 short knocks, followed by a hesitant, almost trembling voice. "Can we talk?" He didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because he had nothing left to say. Not after hearing everything. Not after watching her lie so easily while smiling. She knocked again. "Please open the door." He finally stood and opened it. Her eyes were red, but he knew those tears weren't for love. They were for exposure. For guilt. For the consequences that had finally arrived at her doorstep. "I know how this looks," she began, brushing back her hair, her voice shaking. He stood silently, watching her. "But it's not what you think. It wasn't serious. I was lonely. You're always so distant when you're working. I didn't mean for anything to happen." Excuses. Polished, rehearsed, and poured into sentences as if pain could be erased with clever words. He said nothing. So she continued, her voice rising. Not with honesty, but with desperation. "It was stupid, okay? I messed up. I admit that. But don't throw everything away over one mistake. We can fix this." He finally spoke. "We?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "You mean the same we you replaced behind a locked door?" She flinched, but not from remorse, from fear. Because she could sense it now. The calmness in his voice wasn't forgiveness. It was detachment. The kind that comes when a person has finally stopped hoping. "Look," she said, stepping closer. "You don't have to forgive me right away. Just don't leave. We can work through it. We can go see someone. Therapy, whatever you need." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't cry when I was hurting. You didn't fight for me when I was slipping away in silence. And now that it's your comfort at risk, suddenly you want to work through it." She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Because the truth was staring her in the face, and this time, he wasn't protecting her from it. "If you really loved me," he said, "you would have fought for me before you opened that door to someone else." She cried harder now, her face contorted with panic. But he could see it clearly. This wasn't grief over losing him. It was fear of losing what he gave. The roof. The security. The image of a stable marriage. The man who carried all the emotional weight, so she wouldn't have to. She wasn't crying for love. She was crying for the end of convenience. She tried reaching for his hand. He stepped back. "Don't," he said quietly. "You lost that right when you chose a thrill over trust." She dropped her hand, her sobs now loud, uncontrolled, echoing in the hallway like a song of too late regret. But he didn't comfort her. He had done that for too long. Every time she grew distant, every time she got cold, he had been the one to chase.
To ask.
To compromise.
But not anymore.
She was crying now, but not for the man standing in front of her. She was crying for the walls she thought would never crack. The comfort she thought would never vanish. The safety she thought she could betray and still keep. And as she sank to the floor, shaking, broken in her own way, he turned around, walked back into the room, and closed the door behind him. Not with anger, not with hatred, with peace. Because now he understood. She never fought for his heart. She only fought for her comfort. And he was no longer the man who would settle for that. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm. The kind that clings to walls, hangs in the air, and speaks louder than any scream. He opened the closet slowly, methodically. No rush. No drama. Just movement, steady, final. Each shirt he pulled from the hanger held a memory. A dinner. A birthday. A weekend away. Moments that once felt like pieces of a beautiful life. Now they were just fabric, tainted with betrayal. He folded everything carefully, as if trying to preserve what little dignity remained. On the nightstand sat a photo frame, their trip to the northern hills, wind in their hair, her head resting on his shoulder. They had asked a stranger to take the picture, saying, "We want to remember this day forever." And he would, but not for the reasons he thought. He placed the frame face down. Behind him, she stood in the doorway, not speaking, not stopping him, just watching, as if waiting for him to change his mind. But he didn't, because his mind had finally quieted. The noise of confusion, of denial, of disbelief, all replaced by a heavy kind of knowing. She wasn't crying now. Maybe she had no more tears. Or maybe she realized the ones she shed earlier had done nothing. He packed a book she once gave him, wrapped in gold ribbon. The dedication inside said, "For the man who makes life feel like poetry." He paused, staring at the words. How quickly poetry had turned into silence. He placed the book gently into his bag, zipped it, and stood. Still, she didn't move. Still, she didn't speak. Because deep down, they both knew. There was nothing left to say. This wasn't a decision made in anger. It was made in pain, in disappointment, in the slow realization that love without respect is just a performance. And he was done performing. He walked into the bathroom, gathered a few things, toothbrush, cologne, razor. All routine motions. But each item felt like a goodbye. Not just from the house, but from the version of himself who once believed love could survive anything. He passed her on the way to the front door. She looked at him, eyes searching, hoping, maybe even praying. "Where will you go?" she whispered. He paused, hand on the door. "Somewhere I can breathe." She looked down, arms wrapped around herself like a child lost in her own home. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. He looked at her, really looked. "I didn't have to listen behind that door, either." Her face fell. He turned, opened the door, stepped out. But before leaving, he said one final thing. "You could have stopped me. You could have fought for me. But you didn't. And that says everything." And then he was gone. The suitcase rolled quietly behind him. No slammed doors. No raised voices. Just footsteps, and a silence that screamed louder than anything she had ever heard. And inside the house she stood still, not as a woman in love, but as a woman left behind. Because sometimes, the loudest heartbreak comes without a single sound. He didn't look back. Not once. As he stepped out of the house, the one he had helped build, decorate, protect, the door gently closed behind him. No bang. No dramatic pause. Just the soft click of an ending he didn't need to explain. There was no audience. No neighbors peeking through curtains. No final confrontation in the rain. Just silence. A still, piercing silence that followed him like a shadow. His car was parked where he always left it, under the old neem tree. Its dusty surface held faint handprints from the times she leaned against it while teasing him to take her out. Now it was just steel and silence. Another piece of the life he was walking away from. He placed his bag in the trunk, took a deep breath, and got in. The engine hummed to life, smooth, steady, like it knew he needed it to be strong. As he drove away, the streets looked the same. but he didn't feel like the same man. Every corner reminded him of her. That small cafe she loved. That bookstore where he surprised her with a poetry collection. The pharmacy where he once bought medicine at 2 a.m. because she had a fever and didn't want him to leave her side. Now she didn't want him to stay. He reached the highway, the city lights fading behind him. Still no tears. Not because he wasn't hurt, but because the grief was too deep for tears. He had cried in silence long before this day ever came. He thought of how people always expected breakups to be loud. Crying, yelling, slamming doors. A storm. But his heartbreak was quiet. It had crept in slowly, with every unanswered question, every excuse, every time she turned away from him in bed, claiming she was just tired.
No.
The real goodbye had begun long before he packed that suitcase. The day she stopped choosing him. The day she stopped seeing him. She just didn't realize it. But he had. And now he had chosen to leave. Not to punish her. Not to get even. But to heal. He didn't leave behind a note. He didn't leave his wedding ring on the table. He didn't even take everything that was his. Because some things weren't worth carrying anymore. In her room, she sat on the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. Listening. No slamming door. No final "I'm leaving." Just silence. And somehow that hurt more. Because silence is final in a way words never are. It's not a conversation. It's not a plea. It's a decision. And in his silence, she heard it all. All the things he never said. I waited for you. I believed in us. I forgave you before you even asked. I would have stayed if you had loved me back.
But now,
there was nothing to forgive. Nothing to stay for. And nothing left to say. She buried her face in her hands, but the tears that came weren't from love lost. They were from the weight of silence she couldn't undo. Because he left without shouting. Without accusing. Without begging. And that kind of goodbye, the kind wrapped in dignity and quiet pain, is the kind you never forget. The apartment was small. A one-bedroom space with peeling paint, creaky floors, and a window that overlooked nothing but another wall. But it was quiet. And for now, that was enough. He didn't bring much with him, just a few bags of clothes, a laptop, some books, and silence. At first, the silence was brutal. It echoed off the empty walls, reminded him of what he had left behind, of the conversations that would never happen, of the woman he had once believed was forever. He'd sit by the window some nights, knees pulled up, coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at nothing, just letting the pain settle where it needed to.
it wasn't dramatic.
There were no sobbing fits, no breaking things, just quiet mourning of a man, of a marriage, of the version of himself who once believed love could survive anything, even betrayal. But slowly, the silence began to change. It no longer sounded like grief.
It started sounding like freedom.
He began to breathe easier. He started sleeping without waking up in the middle of the night, wondering what went wrong. He cooked for himself. He played music again, not love songs, but calming instrumentals, like his soul was asking to be gently held. He began journaling, not about her, but about him,
Who he used to be.
who he wanted to become now. He remembered passions he had once shelved to keep the marriage alive, sketching, hiking, late-night walks under city lights. And little by little, those passions returned, like friends who had waited patiently for his heart to remember itself. There were bad days too, days when a memory would sneak in. Her laugh, the way she used to fall asleep on the couch, the time she wore his hoodie and danced in the kitchen. And he'd pause, close his eyes, and let the ache pass. But he didn't reach out. Not once. Because healing, he had learned, means choosing yourself, even when it hurts. He met people in this new part of town. A neighbor who taught him how to make perfect chai. A bookstore clerk who smiled too much and recommended poetry. A gym buddy who had gone through something similar and shared the same kind of quiet strength. And he began to understand something beautiful. He hadn't lost everything. He had lost someone. But he had found himself. She never reached out again. Not a call. Not a message. Maybe she thought he'd come back. Maybe she knew he never would. And that's how they ended. Not with fireworks, not with final words, but with silence that both of them carried in very different ways. Months passed. The apartment felt less empty now. It had a plant in the corner. Photos of sunrises he took on morning walks. Books stacked on the table. Laughter, soft, real, his own. And one evening, as he stood by the window, now open to the breeze, he caught his reflection in the glass. He looked older, yes, but he also looked stronger, grounded,
Whole.
not because someone had come along and fixed him, but because he had done the hardest thing anyone can do. He stayed when it was lonely. He cried when it hurt. And he healed, alone. He didn't need revenge. Didn't want explanations. Because sometimes, the greatest closure isn't hearing why someone hurt you. It's realizing you no longer need the answer. He smiled to himself. Not because life was perfect, but because it was real again. And that was enough.